Ever feel like you're walking a tightrope, trying to navigate the complexities of human interaction with clients and colleagues who might share a different cultural background than us? One wrong step, one misspoken word, and oops, you've stumbled into a cultural misunderstanding. We've all been there, but let's move past the fear and shame. In fact, let's learn from those mistakes and build stronger, more meaningful connections with ourselves and others. To empower ourselves in the field of mental health, how do we take these skills to also help mental health allies so that ultimately clients can get the care they need? Welcome to People of Color in Psychology, the show that explores mental health topics specific to culture, diversity, and communities of color. I am your host, Jack Sun. Our guest today is Lambert Fisher, a licensed marriage and family therapist and holds a Master's of Divinity. Lambert received his degrees from the Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California. Lambert is also an author, a speaker, and has a podcast of his own, the Diversity Dude podcast. Lambert has over 20 years of experience working with individual adults, adolescents, couples, and families. And his passion is in marriage counseling, which integrates his background in psychology and divinity to work with married, engaged, and pre-engaged couples. In addition to his clinical experience, Lambert is a board-approved supervisor for the Minnesota Board of Marriage and Family Therapy and provides supervision for aspiring mental health professionals. Lambert has been supervising counselors for over 15 years. Now, throughout his contributions in clinical and professional atmospheres, and many of our regular listeners on this podcast know, there is a lack of diversity in the field of counseling and psychology. Such issues actually sparked Lambert to publish his award-winning book in 2021, Diversity in Clinical Practice, a practical and shame-free guide to reducing cultural offenses and repairing cross-cultural relationships. And so while it is the case that there is a lack of diversity in our profession, today, Lambert, an African-American therapist, will discuss how there are still steps in which we can take to cultivate culturally safe environments for professionals and clients alike, no matter our cultural similarities or differences. Lambert, I'm excited to have you, and so thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
So I've actually had a chance to listen to a lot of your podcast episodes as well as your TEDx talk. And a message that you do very well is you're really leaning into this idea of the reality that we will be committing offenses. And oftentimes we are so fearful of offending people. We're so fearful of saying the wrong thing. I'm fearful of even confronting my own biases. So I just want to say that is a very transformative idea I want our listeners to understand. The other part too is, can you just tell me a little bit more about your current work, like what you want to share with our listeners?
Well, yes, I put a lot into trying to have a message that is clear and understandable and practically usable, not just some concept. And that was one that I've seen in a variety of different environments that I thought would be practically applicable to everyone. I started doing my marriage and family therapy work, which is the foundation of everything I do, even though I'm seen as the diversity dude on my podcast and a diversity speaker. I'm not a policy and procedure manual creator for DEI policies and social justice. I'm a therapist. I help couples strengthen their relationships with each other. And that's where it started, because at its core, just like many people who get into counseling, psychology in general, it started early on as a kid. My parents divorced, devastated as usual, as is commonly the case. And I started scouring every relationship I could find to try to figure out how to keep a relationship together, because eventually I wanted to be able to do so. And that's what led me to marriage and family therapy. They could teach me how to do it myself, as long as I helped other people learn how to bridge those gaps as well and maintain a relationship in the midst of misunderstandings, in the midst of difficult feelings and poor communication, all that kind of stuff. And so I've been happy to be doing that for a while. But I also began to see that a lot of the differences that got in the way of keeping couples together was not the fact that they hated each other, well, not the fact that there was just actual differences that were insurmountable. It was misunderstanding about those differences. It's feelings that came from those differences. You must think this about me when they actually didn't. Well, I need to protect myself from you when they actually didn't. And so I had the pleasure of helping people come together and see where they were misunderstanding each other, where they really cared about each other and wanted the best for each other. They just didn't know how to express it. And then over time, in addition to seeing couples, I see kids and teenagers and adults and other areas that have nothing to do with relationships. And it started to sound familiar when employees start to say, well, I feel like my boss feels this about me. It's like, wait a minute, that sounds like when a couple and when spouses misunderstand each other. I wonder if these bosses and coworkers are misunderstanding each other. I wonder if the coworkers themselves are misunderstanding each other. And as I started to help people use the same tools that helped couples clarify those misunderstandings, communicate healthily, meet mutual needs, not just one person wins and one person loses, then that surpassed any conflict resolution training I've ever been to, because it was marriage and family therapy training. It wasn't how to get along or else HR is going to get you. It's how to recognize that my coworkers and the people, whether my customers or my coworkers or my bosses, are people who have needs, who are trying to do their best, just like me. So maybe they're not trying to get me. Maybe they're not trying to make me feel hurt. Maybe they don't even realize how they made me feel. But if I communicate in a healthy way and they're doing the same thing, then I can help mend these relationships just like I can the others. And it just so happens that one of the biggest differences that comes up in this day and age is cultural differences that are often misunderstood, often are correlated with those needs that are misunderstood and need to be repaired in a healthy way.
Can you give me some examples of, cultural differences? It's because the word cultural differences is not unique. It's so broad, all encompassing. So give me examples of what you define as cultural differences.
Absolutely. A lot of times people define culture as synonymous with race and ethnicity. And that's a big one. That's cool. But culture is just any group that is correlated with certain ways of being, certain traditions, certain standards, whether it be language or customs or things like that, which means that in addition to grouping yourselves together based on your country of origin, you can have and your racial and ethnic background, you can have gender cultural factors, you can have sexual orientation cultural factors, you can have anybody who can say people like me. You can have political culture and other people who vote like me, socioeconomic culture and other people who have the same income as me. Thus, you can have so many different ways in which, you might be looking at somebody and say, we're just so different culturally. And in many ways, you can be different, but you can also have other things in common with them as well at the same time. So this bridge of cultural differences, like, oh, okay, well, it's not just about skin tone. It's, oh, how do you do things differently where you come from? Where you come from could be your country, could be your state, could be part of the city, or could just be in another department. The way those accountants do it over there is different than the way we do it over here. Y'all don't understand us over here.
Yes, we see that in business all the time.
Broadens the conversation. Yes. Exactly. That broadens the conversation, which means how can we find similarities and differences across cultures? That means it's not one cultural group that's bad or one cultural group that's good. It's not one cultural group that needs to learn about the other cultural groups. It's everybody needed to learn about it. And that takes some of the shame away. That takes some of the guilt away. Oh, you talking about culture stuff? You trying to make me feel bad about myself? No, I want you to feel good about yourself. I want you to feel good about yourself and help other people feel good about themselves as well, so that we all get a chance to feel seen, valued, and affirmed for all of our similarities and our differences, no matter what groups we identify with.
So let's talk about this in the application of the clinical space, because I can just foresee a lot of folks maybe having a little bit of skepticism, right? And so for folks who are thinking, well, I'm working with mixed race couples, or I'm working with same race couples, I'm curious, when in the context of cultural communication, what are things that you have noticed that you want to highlight, like specific examples, and using this as a teaching moment for a lot of us who may not be doing couples therapy, and just having those ideas in mind?
Yes. A lot of times, whether it be individual or couples, it gives you an opportunity to do both. But starting with the couples, it's the idea that a lot of times people see things from their perspective and they don't realize what contributes to them. So you can have a couple. I can just think of certain types of households where one person is the youngest of seven, if I'm thinking of one particular couple, one of seven kids, the youngest. And there's in that household, there's an understanding. They've learned to communicate. If you don't speak loudly and assertively, you didn't want to get heard. So they learn in that household, and even in their broader extended family, loud is the way you speak to show that you care, to show that it's important. But then they married someone who's the oldest of, let's just say a few, and in their household, arguing is correlated with divorce. When the parents
Mm.
argue, they divorce from extended family all over. So you show you care, you show you respect the other person by speaking softly or not speaking at all. So when they come together, one person is saying, why are you yelling? Do you want us to get divorced? Why are you disrespecting me? And that person's thinking, I'm showing you how much I care. I'm showing you how passionately I don't want to do that. But unless they get to the point of understanding each other, they're misunderstanding each other, offended by the silence, and the other person is offended by the loud voice. But they need to take the time to understand, okay, my experience from my family of origin, my background, dare I say, even my own culture, if they have different cultural backgrounds, ethically wise, they can draw the wrong conclusion because they never took the time to understand, wait, why are you doing what you're doing? Even if what you're doing in my environment would mean this, you don't mean that. Okay, I have to learn to interpret you based on where you come from. And if you take the time to do that, then yes, it's going to be new. Yes, it's going to be difficult at first, but that can show how much you care about the other person, that you're taking the time to try to understand them, not interpreting them through your own lens. And that just
Mm.
starts with couples.
So now let's include race in the mix
Absolutely.
as a cultural variable, because I can think of some of my individual clients who are somewhat in that dynamic, that couple. I'm working with an individual and, their partner who I am not seeing, but they are talking about this voice.
Sure.
And of course, my client, and I'm just using, no identifying information, but let's say I have a
Yeah.
client of color. I don't want to
Yes.
be the loud brown person, right?
Okay.
Because then I'm going to be associated, right? So there are certain elements here, nuances that I'm curious about when you are exploring these topics within couples. How does it come up? How do you address it? Any,
Yes.
yeah.
There's often this challenge to meet the client where they're at. Sometimes if I'm speaking with someone who is loud and boisterous, I try to match where they're at, not in a fake way, but in my own version, in my own way, to give them the best version of me that's energetically matching where they're at. And then right after that, in the next hour, I have someone who speaks softly and they speak slowly. And I don't say, well, this is just who I am. No, I try to meet them where they're at. I'm not going to match it. It's not going to be perfect, but it's out of consideration. I show a little bit of movement in their direction. And when I show a little bit of movement in their direction, they don't need me to be exactly them. They just need to see that I'm considerate of them, to be slightly personalized to them. It won't always be the same, but if I'm talking to someone with a more business speak, I'll do that. Someone with a little bit more casual speak, I'll do that. I'll match them as closely as possible. But like I said, not exactly, because some ways I can't do it exactly. I can't be them. I don't know the language. I don't know the slang. I don't know the lingo. I don't all that stuff. And if I try to do something that's fake, use terms I don't know, use language I don't know, then it'll come off as fake. So I have to try to do the best I can by moving in their direction while still authentically being me. And if you do that, then you model for them that they can be authentically themselves as well. If you're not trying to be fake, they don't have to be fake. They can give you the best version of them and know that you're trying to understand them. You're trying to interpret them and create a safe place for them to be them. And you'll do that work to understand them as opposed to requiring them to do it for you, which is even more beautiful when you have a couple, because if you can do it in both ways, say, hey, it's okay for you to be you. And the other person feels like, finally, I'm not being compared to my spouse. And the other person can feel free to be them in the same room. And they can see how both aspects, both personality styles, both cultural styles can be appreciated. And you don't have to choose which one is going to win. And you do that by modeling that movement.
Mm-hmm. Therapist matching. Yeah.
Yeah.
We, that concept, we don't talk enough about that.
Exactly.
We don't. We're so focused on the intervention, this treatment, behavioral family systems therapy, all this stuff, rarely do we ever examine, wait, what's myself, the use of self, right? How do we come and show up
Exactly.
in the therapy space? Um, and also understanding, well, I don't understand so and so's culture. Well, I need to do my best to understand and try, have conversations and learn, continuous learning process. So the other part too that is important is, you mentioned our field is just lacking, that's a fact, in diversity, in terms of racial diversity.
Indeed.
That's a fact.
Indeed.
However, that should not stop us from continuously to cultivate safe environments for professionals so
Yeah.
that, so say a little bit more about that message.
Yes, there are stats, and depending on whether you talk about marriage and family therapists or social workers or psychologists, the stats vary to some degree, but it's generally accepted that at least 90% of the field is white versus therapists of color and things like that. And that's just how the field has developed, and that the number is changing over time, but it's not going to change tomorrow. And so you have this dilemma where there's a question of how much cross-cultural value can be conveyed. There is an increasing amount, especially since COVID, where the stigma is slightly changing from, well, people from my cultural background, from a variety of different backgrounds of color, don't do that thing called therapy. And after COVID, people are like, well, anxiety and stress is hitting everybody. And so we're reevaluating whether we have the luxury to not do that therapy thing. And so there's a lot more people willing to see therapists than there were before, but there's not enough people who, quote unquote, look like them to make them feel comfortable doing so, which is what led me out of the therapy room adjacent. I'm still doing therapy, but in addition to adjacent to the therapy room, to do trainings for my fellow professionals, because I started to see this dilemma where the new clients are coming in saying, hey, I want to do that therapy thing, but I'm looking for somebody who looks like me from my cultural background. And there's not enough people. And the few that are there, their waiting list gets, or their schedule gets filled, and people will wait weeks. They'll wait months for those few under 10% of people, and thus care isn't being received when there's perfectly good therapists down the hall who don't look like them, who can do great work. And they think sometimes, and I've heard this many times, well, they don't want to see me. They don't understand me. It's a waste of time. But when I have my therapy colleagues, my therapist colleagues down the hall, I know for a fact, because I have conversations with them, they would love to see more clients of color. They would like to see them, but they're counting themselves out. Oh, I don't know if I know enough to help out. I don't want to mess up. I don't want to make things worse. So you got two people on both sides wanting to see the other person, but thinking the other person doesn't want to see them. And I couldn't let that stand. And so the challenge is not if you bridge the gap, but how do you bridge that gap? And it starts with accepting that you don't need to know everything about everyone to have a positive impact on someone. There's a lot to learn. There's a lot of differences to overcome. Agreed. But there's a lot that is not culturally specific that can be helpful. So great communication skills, some great empathy. So you don't have to have had every similar experience to be able to say, I can understand more than you think I can. And I don't have to be afraid to ask certain questions. I just need to make sure that I'm not making you feel burdened to teach me all about your whole culture before I can help you. There's strategies that can be put into place that can say, oh, that person doesn't look like me, but they helped out more than I thought they could. Let's see how far this goes. And great work can be done. But a lot of times we don't have a lot of help in doing so. And so that's where I come in. I try to bridge that gap, help therapists and professionals feel less afraid, more competent in doing so. Not just don't be afraid, jump into the fire anyway. It's like, no, if you do it strategically, you won't get burned. It will be helpful. And with certain strategies, I've been helping therapists everywhere bridge that gap so that we can take that 90-10 ratio and make it close to the 70-30 and see if we can make some progress on that. And a lot of people will get helped in the process.
Yeah, it's a pathway to engage therapists as well as clients, helping your colleagues, who
Yes.
may not be therapists of color, understand, hey, you are going to make these cultural offenses.
Yes.
You need to move beyond the fear of making mistakes. And, I have my background in training is a lot of focus on fear. So I treat a lot of anxiety, OCD, and PTSD. So we know fear, aversive behavior. So I'm afraid to commit these offenses. And so I'm
Yeah.
not taking clients. I mean, we can map that out. So I guess I'm wondering too here is, you shared a little bit about how you got into this work. Maybe Can you tell me, as a person of color, what were challenges that you faced and overcame that you would be willing to share?
Well, on a couple sides. One side is that therapist matching challenge. I've been on the receiving end of being both an African American therapist and a male therapist. So I'm a double unicorn, as I've been told many times before. To say, oh well, hey, you're a male. My son needs a good male role model. Can you see him? It's like, well, my schedule's full, but and I focus more on couples than anything else. But I got a great play therapist who works a lot more with kids right down the hall. I know she has availability. It's like, well, nope, I'll wait for you. And they're waiting a long time for the schedule to open up. And there's this idea. It's like, first of all, I'm a therapist, not a big brother. If you want to mentor, there's other sources you can get that from. But if you really want the service, if you really want help, there's a lot of help that can be done that doesn't require matching. Yes, there's an idea. I have to convince people. Yes, there's a certain understanding bridge that is already crossed. Okay, you can trust that I know certain things, and you don't have to explain other things. That is great. It's a good starter, but that's not the most significant change factor. There's a lot of strategies that can be done no matter what the cultural background is. So I've had to overcome that therapist matching factor based on cultural factors, and in this case just African American and male, and there are other factors as well. But there's also that psychoeducational piece, advocating for other work that can be done, again, while I'm trying to train those other therapists to do more than just what they do and to be considered as well. But then also on the general side, there have been opportunities where there are barriers of, well, can you understand me? You're an African American therapist and I'm not. You only know that minority perspective. And I'm like, well, no, I'm a therapist. I can see anybody. Well, what's your political background? What's your economic background? Can you understand my background? Like, first, it doesn't really matter. I can understand what I think I can. Second of all, what past experiences have you had that make you feel that if we aren't exactly the same, it's a waste of your time? And that effort to cross over and show them, I'm not going to judge them for their desire to match. Your desire to match makes sense. You're worried about the fear of lack of understanding. I get it. Maybe you have some past experiences. If I then judge you for that and pathologize that, then I've proven your point. Or I can validate it and reassure you that, yeah, we may not have everything in common, but we probably have a few more things in common than you think, despite the fact that I may not look the same way. And even our differences, I can show you that I have a professional strategy for how to bridge those gaps and learn more as I go. And that has been great. I've learned so much more about different political groups as I've helped people in different political groups. So it didn't really matter whether I voted the same as them. I was able to help them with what I knew and enhance what I knew along the way without burdening them. Different socioeconomic status, higher and lower, is a different kind of enhanced empathy that puts me in their shoes, and that can be a little bit better now than it was 10 years ago, than it was 20 years ago. So having to pleasantly surprise people is part of that challenge that I've experienced as a therapist of color.
Yeah. And really giving yourself permission to have these difficult conversations with clients.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And you're also, you're consistently being genuine because you're acknowledging, here's my limitations, here's what I don't know. However, we do still have some similarities. Let's work with that. And it's,
Exactly.
I love the message. Well, if I make this error, well, it confirms what you're thinking. But if I don't, you'd be pleasantly surprised. Willing to even say that. I think that's quite
Exactly.
bold. And it's great. It's great. So for you, what does it mean to be an African American therapist?
Sure. Two things come to mind primarily overall. First is that you can't deny there's a certain unique empathy that comes from being an African American therapist, not whether I'm experiencing therapy with a African American client or not. There's a certain unique cultural experience being African American in this country, with certain experiences of discrimination, challenges to overcome. The age-old adage of you have to work twice as hard to get half as much. Some are validated, some are not, and it doesn't really matter because they're taught and they have certain experiences. And so the idea of fear, the idea of challenges overcome, the idea of overcoming stigmas, things like that, give me a head start in empathizing with a lot of clients from a lot of different cultural backgrounds. So using that unique empathy to help people who are similar and different has been a great challenge. And some people from other cultural backgrounds haven't had to. Many have, but they haven't had to have those experiences that I did not have a choice but to have. And so instead of considering them a disadvantage, I try to use them all as an advantage in this therapy work and offer a perspective that a lot of my clients don't usually get. The other side that works hand in hand with that is a certain degree of advocacy. Yes, I'm trying to help bridge a gap between the clients who need therapy and the therapists who want to help the clients. But a lot of times, I mentioned it briefly, so I'll just say a little bit more directly now. I'm not going to try to convince people of color to try to go to the other 90% just as an act of faith. Hey, something's better than nothing, when sometimes it can be more damaging, it can be more traumatic, it can be more hurtful. And so in my effort to try to help people make the most of the mental health field as a whole, I also have to do my part to prepare those 90% to be ready to create culturally safe work environments for the people who I'm recommending go see them. And that 1-2 punch is where I'm trying to balance each and every day. And I've been pleasantly surprised by the openness to that teaching. There's a long, and instead of opposition of, we don't want to do that, why are you forcing it? It's we've longed for someone to teach us how to do it because we were scared to learn how to do it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as that's the response, I'll keep doing it, because I don't know about you, but shame and judgment are not my learning language. That makes me want to do less, not want to do more. And so while everything isn't positive, while everything isn't negative, there's a healthy way we can discuss it that doesn't require self-deprecation and shame to do it. And when we're all empowered professionally and client-wise, then a lot more can get done. And I take that on as a part of my responsibility as part of the 10% in this field, to say, hey, how can I help 10%? But hey, how can I help the 90 as well? Because that help by helping one therapist in the 90%, I'm helping every client who they see get a more open and culturally competent experience. And that's well worth it. That's well worth it.
Wow. Yeah, thanks for doing this work. And gosh, I do think clearly there are a lot of organizations, group practices, therapists who are afraid and who don't even know where to look, don't know where to start. And so it is advantageous for many therapists of color to speak up. Granted, it's also a risk as well.
Absolutely.
So it is
Yeah.
a double-edged sword here. So with that, I'm curious, how can we support you?
Well, if nothing else, getting the word out. In general, getting the word out that there is a positive way of doing it is revolutionary to many people, especially in this day and age where there's, from the top to bottom, from the government all the way down to any person who just feels like they're just another number in this country. There's this fear of diversity, equity, inclusion, language, no matter what acronym, no matter what letters you use, and it's often associated with negativity. I went to one of those mandated diversity trainings, Lambert's, and it was negative and shaming and judging. I don't want to do that again. And as if that's the only way to have this conversation. And so when I provide a positive and encouraging training, it's like I'm speaking a different language, because they didn't even know it's possible. And so in part, it's letting other people know you don't have to ban it as if you're banning that negative thing to protect people. We just have to change the conversation to a healthier one. Oh, hey, I know someone who does it. Maybe we should do that. So whether it be through sending people to my TED Talk as an introduction just to a positive perspective, or to my podcast, things like that, or a little bit more strategic. I have a lot of ideas in my book, Diversity in Clinical Practice, which I wrote admittedly for my fellow mental health professionals. That's why it's called Clinical Practice, to help them. But I also wrote it in such a way that I took all the psychological jargon out of it, such that teachers can help create safe culturally safe environments for their students, and C-suite leaders can create culturally safe environments for all of their managers and all their employees. And I've had restaurant owners come to some of my trainings and read the book to say, I want to create culturally safe environments for all of our staff and every customer who comes in, to help them feel seen, heard, and understood. That's how universal we need to make this. So it doesn't have to be, why do I have to do that diversity stuff? It can turn into, how can we get to do it in a way that makes everyone feel seen, heard, and understood? So whether it be sending people to my book or my training, and some people are like, hey, I need this. I had one of those bad diversity trainings. Hey, can I send you to my boss? Can I give my boss your information? So the next time we have to do this, he brings you in because you sound less scary than the last person I did. I'll say, exactly. That's where we come. And so I'm easily findable. Lambertsfisher.com is where people find me. There's not a lot of Lambertses out there, so that's pretty easy. Or I try to make diversity demystified and simple. So on my website, diversitymadesimple.com, to make it more easy to find, since nobody knows what a Lamberts is. And I got different options on there, but just spreading the word in a different conversation. Hey, all that stuff is negative. Well, I heard this podcast one time where this guest was talking about a positive way. Hey, it'd be nice to see if it's true. Let's find out. And whether you're a leader or just someone who shares a casual message in a case consultation or supervision, it can help change the conversation. And if I can help directly, even better. Happy to help.
All right, Lambert. Well, I really encourage our listeners to please check out the Diversity Dude podcast. It's phenomenal. Also, the TEDx talks. Lambert, thank you so much for your time. Any final thoughts?
No, I'm glad to be here. Glad to offer some support to everybody who's listening. And the main message, as I share my podcast, is that no matter how many similarities or differences you may have with people, there's always things you can join you together. And you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to know everything about everyone in order to have a positive impact on someone. That in of itself can start you on a whole different journey to growth that can be very encouraging and positive for everyone involved.
All right. Well, Lambert, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
A huge thank you to our listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, please share and subscribe to People of Color in Psychology. You can also support us by registering for continuing education courses or making a one-time donation on the Multicultural Counseling Institute's website. Your feedback is important to us, so feel free to send an email, a message on LinkedIn, or leave a voice message on our website. Until next time, this is your host, Jack Sun.